getting enlightened about your work. And it is so nice to have you. Adit, please.
You're very generous. Thank you for inviting me. I heard you asking about the farm protests article. I'd be happy to talk about that. The title was along the lines of India's rich farmers are blocking pro-poor reform. So that was the pitch at Foreign Policy, and glad to hear you enjoyed the article.
Thank you, Professor. One thing I would like to start with, to be very honest, see, when we see the way India is being presented in the West, the way India is being presented by its own intellectual in its media domain, whether it is New York Times, Washington Post, Atlantic, Times, Economist, Guardian, BBC, or you take any of the portals here in India, which are completely painting India in a very negative light, and it is quite skewed in their favor. How come you have the interest towards having a very different look towards India and having a very different perspective? So, what was your interest area that you came across this type of writing? Didn't you feel that many people would oppose you for this? Didn't you feel that most of the academic circle is completely in a different mood and they will not like your line of work?
So first, look, as an academic, I have complete academic freedom and job security. And if you're not going to use that to say what you believe in, then why be an academic? I could be making, well, I was making more money working at American Express 20 years ago than I make now as a professor 20 years older and later. So if you're going to become an academic, you should use your academic freedom to do something with it. Of course, most of academia has a different point of view, but the problem, I think, comes from the fact that most of this discourse is driven by people who are India experts, people who've bought into India in a really dedicated way. I mean, say what you want about people like Thomas Blom Henson and Christoph Jafferlat and what's her name at Rutgers, the Truschke, say what you want about them. They're much more India experts than I am. That is, they speak they speak Hindi at a minimum. They probably read Sanskrit. They speak regional languages. They've spent a lifetime studying. Whereas for me, India is just one country among many countries that I study. I'm a dedicated quantitative comparative sociologist. My work is broadly comparative in perspective. So when I came to India because India was an exceptional outlier in its democracy. I say India has the most impressive democracy in the world. I'm not just saying that to play to my new fans. Thank you very much. I'm saying that because it's true. If you control and again, I'm a statistician. I'm not a narrative or qualitative social scientist. I'm a statistical social scientist. If you control for national income per capita, which is the key variable in determining democracy. I mean, all the rich countries are democracies, all the poor countries are dictatorships. The middle-income countries are somewhere in the middle. The Brazils and Russias of the world, they have elections, but they're not very good all the time. If you control for national income per capita, India becomes an extreme positive outlier. It's an extraordinary democracy for a country of $2,000 GDP per capita. And that drove me to the study of India. And so for that was my motivation to study India. I wanted to ask the question, where did India succeed when other democracies have failed? And this is no different from when I used to study economic development. For the first 20 years of my academic career, I focused on economic development. And there, the outliers are South Korea and Taiwan. And so the question was, and I wrote a lot about the Taiwan economy, more about Taiwan than South Korea, but the question was, how has Taiwan been so successful compared to others? I've written a lot about China. How has China grown so rapidly? Because these were outliers, and that was an interesting case. So from the standpoint of democracy, India is absolutely the interesting case. And that's what drove me to it. Now, for the past 3 or 4 years. I mean, if you look at my Twitter profile, you see I just met Shekar Gupta today. It was very generous of him to invite me to come to the office, and it was wonderful. We talked for an hour and a half almost. He
Especially
was
after they wrote a scathing article on you this
no,
early
no,
yesterday.
it wasn't a scathing article. It was what we would say a sophomoric article, meaning that it was juvenile. I mean, and I joked with them about it because, you know, like all's fair in love, war, and journalism. There was nothing wrong with the article. What was wrong, and I made fun of the editor, not Shekhar Gupta, but the news editor. I said, if Ben Bradley, you know, the editor of the Washington Post during the Watergate scandal, if Ben Bradley had had his reporter come to him with this, he would have said, you know, not good enough. There's not a, because, you know, having a $4,000 consulting assignment 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 2 years ago, is not really relevant to anything that's happening today. On top of that, they called me foreign agent, and well, you know, that's clickbait, right? I mean, anyone who registers with these foreign agent registry schemes is technically a foreign agent, but you know, that's just a legal term. It doesn't mean that I'm spying for India or something like that. It just means that I am an agent, meaning someone has hired me, and the person who hired me is outside the country. Therefore, I'm a foreign agent. So it was all ridiculous. You know, if that had been a footnote in a longer article about, you know, about my work on democracy, it would have been entirely appropriate. To make an article about it was clickbait. But look, the print has to make money. You know, you make money by people going to you. And I've seen tons of articles in the Indian media the last 2 days that, you know, I've had nothing to do with, yet they're looking for clicks because I've become a meme, right? And because I've become a meme, you know, people want to capitalize on it. That's fine. Look, I'm very happy to talk to the print and work with the print. They're a great organization. But how do we get off? How did I start talking about the print? Now you've confused me. I haven't had much sleep for 3 days now. Someone remind me, where were we in this discussion?
About
Yeah,
how
I
you got
remember where
involved in
I remember where I was.
India.
I was going to say that my first introduction to India, the place I started 3 years ago when I started reading up seriously about India, was with Shekhar Gupta's Cup to Clutter. I started. The two may not sound very similar to you, but I started with Swamy Vivekananda and his Colombo speech. So my reading started there, and my YouTube watching started with Shekhar Gupta. So I've been thrilled that, you know, 3 years later, I have watched probably several thousand hours, not thousands, but, you know, 6 days a week for 3 years. That's a lot of Shekhar Gupta that I owe him for educating me about Indian democracy. But I went back, you know, after taking the quantitative view of Indian democracy, I went back and started reading and you know, read the entire independence literature in English. Most of it is available in English. Not all. I know there's some sources in Indian languages, but most of India's independence leaders wrote in English. Not only that, most of them wrote entire books in English. You know, you can read Ambedkar's books, you can read Rajendra Prasad's books, you can read Nehru's Discovery of India. Gandhi's books are in English. Savarkar wrote in English. Even Golwalkar wrote in English, right? So it was great to be able to read this literature. I became a big fan of Deendayal Upadhya, who, of course, you know, wrote in English. He also wrote, I think, in Indian languages, but his integral humanism speeches were made in English. So it was great to be able to really educate myself about Indian democracy. But the quantitative comparative approach came first. That's what I do. I published a book 10 years ago on methods for quantitative cross-national research. It's the one area of statistics where, if I can be immodest, where I'm one of the global experts, and it's that approach, taking a quantitative cross-national approach to understanding India, or to understanding democracy, and that approach showing that India is the exceptional case. That's what brought me to studying India.
Professor, thank you. We will take question from others. I have one more question. In fact, I have so many questions, but right now I'll stick to one basic question. We saw we read through your article about this quantitative comparative analysis. We saw the manipulation in the indices, everything we have seen it. Your take on this Indian intellectual as a class in public persona are anti-India. We understand that part. But what we see is a trend from the Western intelligentsia, which is completely anti-India, anti-Hinduism, anti-Hindu.
Yeah.
What is the main reason? It's not. Please do define to us what is the basic reason for being so anti. Is it colonial hangover? Is it deep-seated anti-paganism? What is it? We want to understand. Rajiv Malhotra has been working on this project,
Yes,
and
I know, I
we
know.
consume a lot from him. But as a very common citizen, we fail to understand why West is so against us.
Yeah. So first I would say anti-heathenism, not anti-paganism. I know there's arguments over those two words. We can get into the etymologies and the English usage some other time. I think there is a deep-seated anti-heathenism and anti-Hinduism that results from that. But today, even though most Westerners are secular, the people who are anti-India are not religious people. They're still inheriting a Protestant Anglo-American mindset about India. Now, I mean, if you go back to even before the independence struggle in India, Britain had a 18th, 19th century love affair with Islam and with political Islam. Of course, there were problems, and I don't want to minimize all the frictions involved, but the kind of Lawrence of Arabia fascination with Islam is something that's been present all along, and it is very, if I can borrow the word from Edward Said, who might, in his grave come haunt me for this, it is very Orientalist, but it was positive Orientalist. That is, people who romanticized Islam and forgave it its sins because in their imagination, this was the other, right? It's fine for a Muslim dictator, a Jinnah for that matter, on his in his inn of court. I forget which inn. Savarkar was at Gray's Inn, and I think Jinnah was Middle Temple or Inner Temple. I'm not sure. Jinnah's temple glorifies him. Great independence leader who's there, despite the fact that he, was responsible ultimately for the division of India, 1 million people dying in partition, and the creation of a, dictatorial, militaristic Pakistan. Yet he's admired because the standards they would hold Islam to are not the Western standards that we hold ourselves to. There's this Orientalist romanticization of Islam that is really sad to see because it's, people overuse the phrase tyranny of low expectations, but it's not exactly low expectations. It is an expectation. Well, you know what it is? I'll put it in a word. It's Islamophobia. It is an idea that a Muslim will, of course, be violent, irrational, but nonetheless noble, and somehow eminently respectable, but respectable as an other. So there's a strong British that carried over into American academia romanticization of Islam, where disappointingly, Islamic studies scholars in the West do not generally put much support for democracy in the Muslim world. They don't expect democracy of the Muslim world. Now that fascination with Islam has been combined with that has been combined with an anti-Hinduism. That, of course, in British India, the British viewed Muslims in some sense as civilizationally acceptable, whereas Hindus were not. Hindus were heathen. Muslims were, or Abrahamic faith. And so there's a lot of this old hangover. But the strange thing is, how does this get to the current day? Like, what are the transmission mechanisms from 18th and 19th century colonialism to 21st century Harvard and Oxford? It's hard to see them until you start looking at work like Rajdeep Malhotra's work, where you start realizing that no, these lineages exist. The same institutes are there at these institutions, and they share a sense of a set of prejudices. So you have the bizarre connection between Western intellectuals who are no longer Christian, right? They're still Abrahamic in their mindset. They're still Protestant and Puritanist in their mindset, even though they're no longer Christian. They're now secular. They're now atheist, and they still have that, vague detestation It's not a Hindu phobia. No one's afraid of Hindus. It is a detestation of Hindus. It is an anti-Hindu bias. Now, it doesn't take a lot of bias through groupthink, through social networks, elite social networks. I don't mean online social networks, to solidify into an alliance. I mean, if you were to count the number of prominent Western scholars who are thoroughly opposed to Indian democracy, I mean, I named 3 earlier. Maybe you guys can name a 4th or a 5th. We're not talking about a lot of people. We're talking about a small number of well-positioned people who very comfortably work with anti-democratic Islamist intellectuals in their own universities, who share, you know, if not necessarily an aversion or being anti-Hindu. I mean, Audrey Truschke is not anti-Hindu as such, but she thinks, from what I can tell, I've never met the woman, but she seems to think, she knows what would be a better Hinduism. And of course, that's not for us to decide what a better Hinduism would be. It's for Hindus to decide what a better Hinduism would be. But this is the challenge facing India: is this bizarre and unholy alliance between mostly Western Islamists and mostly Western Puritan heritage intellectuals.
I mean, Professor Babones, I'm actually based in the UK, and I was one of the main coordinators for the BBC protest that happened in London.
Right.
And uh, what the trigger point for us was essentially was the Leicester issues, the Leicester riots that
Right.
happened from September 12th onwards. But despite all the assurances that we got from the polity in Britain, from the police in Britain, from all of different dimensions and different domains of the government, was that it was going to be an unbiased, sort of a review that they would conduct. The mayor of Leicester, what he does is he essentially calls out a gentleman called Dr. Chris Allen. I don't know if you've read about him or if you've read of him.
No, and
Uh,
apologies. I've not been following. I'm aware of the Leicester violence, but I haven't been following it closely. I apologize.
but he is essentially a professor of Islamophobia in the University of Leicester, and
Right.
he is a conspiracy theorist who essentially believes that the 9/11 was an insider job. So
Mm-hmm.
when the state essentially goes out and gets people of that kind of pedigree uh, to conduct an independent academic review again for riots that have happened against the Hindus, do you not believe that the Hindus should be up in arms in the Western civilization, in the Western world, especially that they've given so much, they've contributed so much into the economy. There's such a peace-loving community. There hasn't been much skirmishes that people can point towards from that perspective. Do you not believe that a lot of wrong has been done from the Western civilization world as well, from the Western democracies, instead of making us their allies, they're turning us into their enemies, sort of thing?
So first, let's be clear. I mean, we all know this, but in case anyone's recording this and wants to replay it, when you say up in arms, we mean that metaphorically. No one is
Yeah, yeah,
calling
yeah,
for.
yeah.
Well,
I
look,
didn't mean.
I know you mean that. I just, want to be absolutely clear because people do take things out of context and try to. Well, that's unfortunate that there's so much misrepresentation, intentional misrepresentation of what people say. Um, Look, it's up to Hindus to defend Hindus. Just before I came on, there was a speaker talking about, it's up to India to set the narrative on India. It's not my job. Now, it's your job, yes. And if you are Hindu and believe in organization for self-protection, uh, obviously, organize, right? And I think that organized involvement in politics is almost always a good thing. Elites don't like that. I mean, whether it's elites in India in the 1940s and 50s, repressing the RSS because they viewed it threatening that someone outside the elite was organizing to be involved in society, or trying to organize society as the RSS would have it. In the same way, in the United States, when ordinary people organize. I mean, you may have seen the school board protests in Virginia, and when ordinary parents came together and said, "These are our schools. This is what we want for our schools and our children." elites, they called in the FBI to investigate ordinary parents. And I wouldn't be surprised if Britain calls in MI5 to investigate Hindus who organize in Leicester, even though they're only organizing to present a more accurate narrative about their own community. The challenge for elites is that ordinary people in society, have their own voice in a democracy, and they can have it by organizing and by working together to amplify their own individual voices. Elites find that very threatening. It's unfortunate, but sure, you should do it. I'm sure people are already doing it. We all, and that's not just good for Hindus. I want to emphasize, I'm not Hindu. I'm not protecting Hindus. I'm not a spokesman for Hindus. Believe it or not, and please, no one come to my hotel and try to help me tomorrow. I'm too busy. I've never even been to inside a Hindu temple. I've been in many mosques, many churches. I've never been inside a Hindu temple. I think it's the only major religion whose facilities I've never experienced. So look, I'm not doing this speaking, and I would encourage Muslims the same. That is, if Muslims in Leicester felt that their community was being improperly marginalized, I would say, you know what, get together, do it in a civil society sense. No, you don't need funding from Pakistan or Saudi Arabia. You don't need the mosque to speak for you. Very often now I don't know the situation in Leicester, but very often in Muslim communities, it becomes the mosque that speaks for people instead of civil society speaking. Versus, my impression is that because Hindu, my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, because Hindu temples tend not to have that kind of hierarchical organization, there's not this sort of people who speak for Hindus in the community because they are the religious leader. So, I would encourage Muslims to be civil society organizing, not just organizing within their religious organizations, but organizing without them in civil society. And Christians and atheists, I mean, there's nothing, it's positively good for democracy when there are multiple organized bases of opinion in society.
Thank you, Professor. We're not going to bound you. We're not going to bind you here. We understand you're sleep deprived. You can leave whenever you want to. It's just please do not be obligated to stay on if you feel that you need.
If you have more
that
questions,
much
it's great. But
I have a quick one for the
but
professor.
absolutely 10 o'clock.
Absolutely
10 o'clock.
We'll take a few questions from our people who are in speakers, sir. Just the only thing is, please be very pointed and do not give any observation. Rather, ask a pointed question, because it's a very good opportunity. A person who is in a limelight in mainstream media has come to a very little community space here. So, Rajinder ji, first you ask question, and then we can go to Hina and Tayaji Neorizing.
And I'll try to give shorter answers, I promise.
Thank you, Professor Babones. My simple question is that somebody not too well known till 4 days back, within 31 minutes of his interview, becomes so well known, and through that 31 minutes of interaction, he rattles the entire left, which results in people coming to the rescue of the interviewer, his wife and all. How do you evaluate this cookie crumbling within 31 minutes? How do you evaluate it all? Thank you.
Look, I don't know if the cookie crumbled. I remind everyone the crowd of relatively elite, not relatively elite, absolutely elite, probably mostly, well, I don't know their politics, whether they're Congress supporting or not, but the crowd at the India Today conclave, and India Today is not a RSS organization, right? This is not part of the song. That crowd was enthused, and everyone, people clapped. And I want to tell you, I know Rajdeep, the journalist, Rajdeep. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on his name. Sardesai. Rajdeep Sardesai. I know he's got a lot of flack. He was absolutely professional with me. rehearsed this all beforehand. He gave me these easy questions that I could give the answers to. But his mother, so I'm a sociologist. His mother is a Marxian sociologist here in India. I don't know her politics, but look, she's a Marxian sociologist. I know she disagrees with the politics of the current government in India. She came up to me afterwards, was so effusive, said it's so wonderful to see a sociologist engaging like this. She said, everything you said needed to be said. She said, I would use different methods. I would talk, but she kept shaking my hand. She wanted selfies with me. The India Today media people had to drag me away from her. She was saying all of her friends were there. So all these nice old ladies, were, oh, that's fantastic. You said that. Thank you for standing up for India. So, it's not the left. I think there are well-meaning, good-hearted, patriotic people on all sides of politics. There may be individuals who are upset with what I said, but none of them emailed me. I mean, I haven't been able to read all my tweets. There's been a million tweets. But I read all my email, all my LinkedIn correspondence. I haven't had any negative replies at all. Nothing, zero. And Marxist sociologists, old lady Marxist sociologists from Lloyton's Delhi and the traditional elite are wanting selfies with me.
That's profoundly insightful. Sorry, Rajendra sir, you were saying something?
Yeah, I said he has a fan in Nandini Sardesai now in India. So that's +1.
Or Rajendra sir, or we have lost him to the other camp. Would you say that?
I'm not in any camp. I'm an American. If you like what I say, I'm thrilled that you like it. I'm not on your side. I'm just presenting an accurate picture of India as Indian democracy as I see it. That's all.
Sure. It was just on a way.
My question to you, Professor, would be in two parts. The first part being, I am always perturbed by how the left intellectuals somehow find a reason to align themselves with Islam, a conservative ideology. Some would say even a political conservative ideology presented as a religion. And the second part of my question is, as you would probably agree, and the subject of the space is also India's intellectuals are anti-India. Well, it's obviously it's not a hidden fact that I think people on the right and the intellectuals on the right are very few far in between. So I think we're on the way to cultivate new faces, new intellectuals, but I feel it's a very long process. What do you think it would take to make more prominent faces and intellectuals coming out of our society? Thank you.
So first, the idea that intellectuals of the left are somehow, that they often are sympathetic to Muslims is understandable. Look, everything I've read suggests that there is a real problem of Muslim social exclusion in India. Not every Muslim, not at every level, but broadly speaking, that there's a phenomenon of social exclusion. Sorry, phone's going off too. I can't silence that. That's the room phone. I don't know if you can hear it. So, good-natured, well-meaning people who want to improve their society, of course, want to do something about this and include Muslim voices and bring Muslims in. Now, part of the problem is that unfortunately, very often when leftists or liberals, want to do this, instead of going to the grassroots, I know Narendra Modi has made a big issue of the BJP should be reaching out to Peshmerga Muslims. That's the right approach. But instead, the easy approach is, let me find someone who is, elite, well-spoken, internationally educated, who I can put forward as my Muslim poster child. Right. So there's a lot of tokenism that results. And look, this is a battle we have, in the U.S. as well. Does simply having quote unquote representation of a relative, does that just benefit a small number of elite people from that socially excluded minority, or does it really promote inclusion? Now, my own feeling is it does not promote inclusion. It just is tokenism. Real inclusion comes from bringing people into your organizations, into your society, into your families. That's the real challenge. Now, the second part of what you said, very quickly, could you give me a quick prompt? Conservatives. You asked about conservatives.
Hina, could you repeat
I
that?
think he just wants you to rephrase that question.
Very quickly, just a prompt.
I'm so sorry. I totally lost you.
Oh no, I was asking what my phone's going off in the
That's it.
background. What were you?
Do you want to take your phone? Answer your phone, maybe.
I can't. I'm sorry. What were you asking about conservatives?
Oh, I was just talking about how we could cultivate, an ecosystem on the right, because it's, no hidden fact that the intellectual society
Oh,
in
okay. Yes,
India,
yes.
at least,
Okay.
it's
Yeah.
predominantly on the left.
Yeah. Look, not just in India. We have data for this in the United States. It's very true in Australia. We don't have data for Australia. And in the United States, there's data because political contributions go into public databases. And studies have been done of the percentage of donations that go, for example, to Democrats versus Republicans by profession. University professors are overwhelmingly, not just university professors in the humanities and social sciences, the whole university, I forget the numbers, but it's something like 95-5, Democrat versus Republican. So this is just a phenomenon of universities. Universities attract people who, are idealistic, who believe in causes, right? I mean, there are tons of communists in universities. You go outside universities, communists are very thin on the ground. I mean, the last bastions of communism are universities. So you can't really change it. It's impossible for conservatives to change this narrative. And there have been efforts in the US, in Australia. In the US, they've tried to create separate universities like Austin University in Texas. In Australia, there is an organization called the Ramsay Center for Western Civilization that tried to give a couple $100 million to universities to start basically conservative programs in Western civilization. They couldn't get universities to take it. There were mass protests. They eventually did get universities, but not the prestigious universities they wanted. This lock on universities is there. I think the appropriate strategy for conservatives, and I want to stress, I'm not a conservative. I respect conservatism, but it's not my natural métier. Conservatives, if they want to be more prominent in these debates, don't even try to do it at the universities. Do it outside the universities, and people are there. The conservatives are much more prominent on YouTube, I believe. They're much more effective on YouTube. There are other places you can go to be part of the intellectual debate in society, other than in universities. And I encourage people to create bases of support for things they believe in, not just try to control, not to only try to fight in the existing institutions, but to try to create institutions on the outside. There are lots of ways you can contribute in society that don't involve being at universities.
Yeah, thank you. I think we'll move to Dio. Before that, Professor, we would like to say that we don't want anyone in our camp. Rather, we want an impartial, neutral academician who is honest. I think that would
Well,
suffice
that's
our cause.
impossible. That's very difficult. Look, academics are incredibly self-indulgent, and that's the problem. Now, I'm self-indulgent in that I choose research projects just because I happen to want to. And look, the university would much prefer that I just churn out quantitative cross-national models of development year after year, because that would improve my Google H index. It would improve the university's standing. But we're self-indulgent. I have tenure. I can study what I want. Now, I use that self-indulgence to choose my field of study, but I feel at least that I am very committed to promoting an accurate fact-based view of the world in areas where I always look, or for areas where that is lacking. Most academics, though, most social science academics, once you don't have an overseer, you just have a job for life, you can do what you want, it's very easy to conflate your own personal preferences with your research. You decide that what you believe is the truth, and we are all prone to that. But in academics, among academics, it's terribly bad because academics don't have oversight.
Thanks, sir. Dio, you can ask your question, then we'll move to Neorizing. Yeah, please.
Hi, Mr. Babones. Thanks for joining us, and hope you can join us more often. Um, Also, thank you for putting a well-known rabble rouser in his place, a prominent one at that. Uh, because of your proximity to Indian politics, uh, do you see parallels between the liberal ecosystems in the West and what's going on in Indian political systems?
Yes, very much so. I mean, India is not so different. While they're knocking on my door, I have no idea what's going on. India is not so different from the Anglo-American world. It's very similar in many ways, and the fault lines are very similar. We think because India is such a big country, because it's culturally so different, that everything must be different. But I recognize, all the sorts of patterns that we find in America, I can find in an analogous way in India. I mean, there's a liberal elite that controls the major institutions. There's a basic alliance between establishment liberals and Marxian intellectuals. They're the same sort of patterns appear. Conservatives are marginalized in the intellectual world, but often win elections. But then they have trouble pursuing their policies when they win elections because they face bureaucratic obstruction, because the bureaucracy as a whole is part of that, liberal establishment class. So all these patterns play out in India that we're familiar with from the U.S. It's not so different in the end.
And do you see any major differences between the two?
Oh, of course. I mean, there's tons of differences between India and the U.S. The personalities are different. The way politics are conducted. I mean, there's no caste in the U.S. The closest we have to quote unquote vote bank politics is the African American vote. But other than the African American vote, there's none of that. U.S. is far wealthier. The issues are different. But some things are strikingly similar. I mean, take cow protection in India. Horse slaughter is illegal in the United States. Why is it illegal? Because people love horses. No religious connection. It's just a fondness for horses. So U.S. horses get exported to Mexico and Canada for slaughter. Well, it's a bizarre. It is a bizarre similarity to the debate over cow slaughter in India, and people saying, well, all that happens is that the Indian cows get exported for slaughter abroad. And it's just amazing to see these parallels, but obviously most things are very different. And I would put it this way: the structural issues. I'm a structural sociologist. The structural issues in many ways are parallel because they have to do with simply how societies work. The cultural issues are entirely different. These are completely different cultures. But social structures are social structures. Structures of power. Social exclusion is social exclusion, and the phenomenon works the same whether it's Muslims in India or African Americans. Rajiv Malhotra has made a big point of this, that there are efforts to present Dalit exclusion in India in racial terms, and to consider it a Black Lives Matter movement in India that has Dalits at its core, and considering this to be a racist, parallel to a critical race theory application to India. Well, people are doing that because, you can take, it's culturally completely different. There's nothing in common with race in America and castes in India. But, you can use the same tools, and you can effectively use the same tools for good or for bad.
Yeah, thank you, sir, and I hope you'll throw all
Yeah.
your weight behind Mr. Modi and his and his political ideology.
Like he said,
No, I
he's
think
apolitical, so I think we'd like to leave him like that. But just adding to Dio's questions, Professor Babones, the Muslim vote in the US has become quite critical, and we saw that in the last elections. There were quite a few swing votes. which actually went towards Joe Biden, and President Trump was not very happy about it. I think there's about 3.5 million Muslim voters, and they essentially vote as a consolidated vote bank. Do you not believe that they work similar to how they essentially function in India as a consolidated vote bank?
Look, Muslims face social exclusion in India, in Australia, in the US, and in the UK. Now, I don't mean they face necessarily discrimination. They face social exclusion, meaning that they live apart in many ways. They form their own communities outside the mainstream of society in a way that, say, Indians in the US or Australia don't. Well, maybe Indians in Australia, but certainly not Indians in the US. Indians in the US are fully integrated into U.S. society, Indian Hindus, I should say. So any socially excluded group ends up prone to vote bank politics. I mean, so I'll give you an example of how it works in Australia. In Australia, Muslims are overwhelmingly voting for the Labour Party in Australia. The Labour Party is promoting it has a whole narrative around trans rights, around having drag queens in schools, about women's and gender rights, women's quotas, all these sort of very progressive gender and sexuality issues that are anathema in the Australian Muslim community. But the Muslim community gets its veto. Yes, you hear me? The Muslim community gets its veto over the one or two issues it cares about. So it gets a veto over Israel. Australia, just last month, re-recognized Tel Aviv as the capital of Israel and unrecognized Jerusalem. Now, that's not done. I mean, when the state makes a decision, that's an act of state, not an act of government. And the recognition of Jerusalem by the last government in Australia should have stuck. But the Labour Party's beholden for a certain number of issues to the Muslim preference, and so that change was made purely to mollify the Muslim vote bank of the Labour Party. Now, that sort of thing with socially excluded groups happens. I have an article out just now on Quadrant. It's a humor article. I write a humor column called The Philistine, and the current edition of The Philistine is on Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris is vice president because the African-American community, the leaders of the African-American community insisted, Joe Biden will support you. What we get is Kamala Harris. Now, they may regret it now, but that's what they wanted and that's what they got. They get one special issue and then they're ignored on everything else. Okay, I have to go.
Can I do a quick one on theory?
Can we take one last question, Professor Babones?
Yeah, but if my phone rings again, I have to answer it.
Neil, you can go first.
Brought it up really quick. You bring up critical theory. We see the rise in the West, and just to paraphrase, it's really where you rewrite history in terms of oppressor and oppressed, and you try to find ways for the oppressed communities to then, have equity and whatnot. It's a very activist kind of agenda. Why is it that you see Kanye West, being canceled? You talk about anti-Semitism, obviously what happened to the Jews. It's understandable. Indians, specifically Hindus, have a 1,000-year history of being oppressed. If you look at the number of deaths and genocides, you could say there's no other group in the history of mankind that has been more genocided and oppressed than Hindus. How is it that within the West, Hindus specifically, there seems to be a disdain and view Hindus, Modi, as fascists, oppressors? Because if you actually take the context and theory behind critical theory, it would suggest that the world should be trying to uplift Hindus in any way we can. And how would you describe that contradiction? It doesn't make any sense.
That's an extraordinarily complex question. I don't think I can answer it in 1 minute. Look, everything has much more to do with practical politics than with actual theory. I mean, the theory justifies what people feel. All of critical theory that's been exported from Germany, the Germans meant it. Americans don't mean it. It's just a vocabulary they can use. It's like Bernie Sanders calling himself a socialist. He's not a socialist. He's not going to nationalize America's state industries if he were to be president. We take the vocabulary of critical theory, we don't actually take the theory of critical theory because it's so foreign to Anglo-American traditions. So we're taking this vocabulary and we're applying it to our own political sociology. In our political sociology, African Americans are socially excluded, and so we apply critical theory to them. But it wasn't meant for them. it was developed in a much different context, and this is a problem. I mean, even the words left and right were developed for the French Revolution, and the left are the Jacobins, sorry, and the right are the monarchists, and that's meaningless in the Anglo-American context. We've used the terms, but American quote-unquote leftists are nothing like the real leftists in Europe or Latin America. American quote-unquote right-wingers are nothing like the real right-wingers in Latin America and Europe. Don't take the theory too seriously. I know the people who propound the theory believe they take it seriously. But I think if you go back and read the original work and start thinking, is this actually being applied?
But
it's
I mean,
not.
Professor, the one issue is you look at like Kanye being canceled. There's so much anti-Hindu commentary, Hindu phobia.
Yeah,
There's
I
no
know.
consequence to anybody who spreads
Yeah,
it.
Kanye got canceled before he said anti-Semitic things. The anti-Semitic things are just gotchas. Oh wait, now we can really cancel him. He was canceled for being a Republican Trump, for being a black Trump supporter. That's what got him canceled. There are tons of
Nobody's canceled for their anti-Hindu
no, but I
comments.
mean, there are tons of ultra in the African American community. Anti-Semitism is rife. There are tons of left-wing anti-Semites in the quote unquote left-wing, progressive anti-Semites in the African American community. They don't get canceled for their anti-Semitism because they're on the correct side, quote unquote, for that group of people. Look, I'm very sorry that there's been so much
Professor,
anti-oppression. But I want to
I
emphasize
understand.
this is not about actual oppression. Oppression is just the language of it. It's simply applying that language to things you already feel. Pareto, I'm a big fan of Vilfredo Pareto, the classic Italian economist and sociologist. And Pareto insisted, and I wrote a humor column about Pareto too, if anyone wants it, Google it or ask me for it. He said, look, people have these feelings and then they'll have derivations to try to explain why their feelings are correct. But the feelings are the fundamental thing, not the intellectual justification for the feelings. I just don't take critical theory very seriously. I don't think it's you can't get into a battle of no, we're actually more oppressed than someone else. Who wants to be in that battle? Correct the record, right? The battle of who's more oppressed is just not one you even want to win, right? So let it go. Let people, let shrill people yell on the margins and move on with your lives. That would be my advice. But I have to go. I'm very sorry.
Thank you so much, Professor Babones. It was such a delight to host you here today.